March 25th has carried legends of lagoon builders staking out Venice, rebel kings grasping a crown, astronomers charting new moons, lawmakers banning the slave trade, and marchers demanding the vote. Today we leap across centuries to watch Maryland's shoreline take root, factories rewrite labor law, treaties knit continents, and soldiers depart distant coasts. Let's rewind. This is your This Day in History. On March 25, 421, tradition says builders laid the first stone of San Giacomo di Rialto, marking Venice's birth atop the tidal marshes. Merchants hammered wooden piles deep into the silt, engineering floating foundations that let warehouses rise above the tides. By torchlight, families from Padua and Aquileia mapped out calli and campi around the fledgling church, turning sandbars into neighborhoods. Lagoon boat rights shaped sleek hulls for trade to Byzantium and the Levant, seeding the maritime economy that would define the Republic. Canal watchmen set up bell towers and footbridges, creating civic rhythms that balanced religious ritual with commercial hustle. Venice's mythic noontime founding became civic lore, reinforcing the city's identity as a self-made power shielded by water. On March 25, 1306, Robert the Bruce knelt at Scone Abbey to claim the Scottish crown amid English occupation. The coronation stone had been hidden from Edward I, so nobles raised a makeshift wooden platform draped in tartan banners. Bishop William de Lamberton anointed Bruce, lending church legitimacy to a rebellion still reeling from rival clan feuds. Messengers rode north to rally Highland support, promising that Bruce's kingship meant renewed war for independence. English garrisons quickly branded the ceremony treason, ensuring the new king's first acts would be guerrilla campaigns. On March 25, 1634, the ships Ark and Dove anchored at St. Clement's Island, and Lord Baltimore's settlers claimed the Maryland shore. Jesuit Father Andrew White raised a cross and held Mass, blending ceremony with a diplomatic welcome to the Yaucomico people. Colonists offered trade goods and promised peaceful land purchase, seeking to avoid the violent clashes that scarred other English footholds. Surveyors paced the bluffs above the Potomac to plot St. Mary's City, designed with broad streets to impress visiting tribes and royal inspectors. The charter's promise of relative religious toleration attracted Catholics and Protestants alike, making the settlement an early test of pluralism. Tobacco seedlings and corn caches were shared between settlers and Yaucomico farmers, tying the young colony's survival to local alliances. On March 25, 1655, Christian Huygens sketched a bright orb beside Saturn and realized he had found a new moon, later named Titan. Working with a home-built telescope in The Hague, he refined Saturn's ring geometry, letting the satellite's orbits snap into focus. Huygens' anagram letter to Blaise Pascal hid the discovery's details until he could publish, reflecting savant-era scientific secrecy. The finding confirmed that Saturn possessed a multi-moon system, bolstering the Copernican model over geocentric holdouts. European mapmakers added imaginative engravings of Titan to celestial atlases, feeding the public appetite for extraterrestrial worlds. Centuries later, ESA's Huygens probe would descend through Titan's haze, honoring the meticulous observer who first spotted it. On March 25, 1807, King George III signed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making Britain the first major power to outlaw the traffic. William Wilberforce's parliamentary allies celebrated in candlelit rooms, exhausted after 20 years of petitions, pamphlets, and votes. Naval architects began outfitting West Africa Squadron frigates with faster hulls to chase slavers along the Bight of Benin. Insurance brokers in Liverpool recalculated ledgers, recognizing that seizures and fines would now target their investment networks. Black British activists such as Olaudah Equiano were cited in newspapers, their testimonies credited with swaying public sentiment. Colonial governors received stern dispatches, warning that any complicity in clandestine shipments would lead to removal. Enslaved communities across the Caribbean heard the news via ship whispers, inspiring both hope and frustration that bondage itself remained. The law's ripple effects pushed other Atlantic nations toward prohibition, setting the stage for broader emancipation struggles. On March 25, 1911, fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, trapping young immigrant seamstresses behind locked exits. Overloaded scrap bins and oil-soaked fabric fed the blaze, while a single, frail hose sputtered uselessly against the flames. Some workers escaped via the narrow stairway, but smoke and heat drove many toward jammed doors guarded to prevent theft. Firefighters' ladders reached only the 6th floor, forcing desperate jumpers to aim for life nets that tore under the impact. Within minutes, the Ash Building's top floors were gutted, and the death toll shocked a city accustomed to industrial risk. Public mourning parades swelled through Lower Manhattan, uniting labor unions, clergy, and reformers in grief. The catastrophe accelerated workplace safety laws, birthing modern fire codes, sprinkler mandates, and the Factory Investigating Commission. On March 25, 1931, 9 black teenagers were pulled from a freight train near Paint Rock, Alabama, and swiftly accused of assault. Local deputies hustled the youths into the Scottsboro jail as mobs formed outside, necessitating National Guard protection. Within 2 weeks, rushed trials delivered death sentences from all-white juries, exposing the racial machinery of Southern courts. International labor defense lawyers intervened, tying the case to global anti-lynching campaigns and fundraising drives. U.S. Supreme Court rulings in Powell v. Alabama and Norris v. Alabama later demanded fair counsel and integrated juries. Although most defendants spent years behind bars, their ordeal reshaped American criminal procedure and civil rights strategy. On March 25, 1957, 6 European states gathered in Rome's Palazzo dei Conservatori to sign the treaty creating the European Economic Community. Konrad Adenauer, Paul Henry Spaak, and other leaders exchanged pens and embraced, determined to bind former adversaries through trade. The treaty established a common market, lowering tariffs on coal, steel, and agricultural goods to spur post-war recovery. New institutions like the European Commission and Court of Justice were mapped out to arbitrate disputes above national politics. Citizens read front-page headlines about a United States of Europe in embryo, debating sovereignty versus prosperity. On March 25, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led thousands of marchers up Baxter Avenue to Alabama's capital after the Selma to Montgomery trek. A rainbow of clergy, students, and local activists carried American flags and sang spirituals, protected by federalized troops. At the marble steps, King delivered his How Long, Not Long speech, promising that the arc of the moral universe would bend toward justice. Television crews broadcast the disciplined line of marchers nationwide, eroding support for segregationist Governor George Wallace. Within months, Congress channeled the march's momentum into the Voting Rights Act, authorizing federal examiners to protect ballots. On March 25, 1994, the last U.S. Marines of Operation Restore Hope boarded helicopters in Mogadishu, ending America's ground mission in Somalia. The withdrawal followed 18 months of famine relief entangled with militia clashes, capped by the 1993 battle memorialized as Black Hawk Down. United Nations commanders handed responsibility to a smaller Pakistani-led contingent, shifting focus to diplomacy over armed convoys. Washington defense planners studied the exit as a cautionary tale about humanitarian interventions without stable political partners. From lagoon legends to legislation, March 25th reveals how communities build, burn, reform, and march until justice feels within reach. Until tomorrow, this was This Day in History.